Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is Intro to Culture, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. So in this video, we're going to learn a few new terms, but also review a bunch of stuff that you have already learned. So get your vocab sheet and get ready to copy some terms. First word is culture, the learned beliefs and practices of a group of people. You don't have to write this down, but the important thing to remember about culture is that it is man-made. People come up with these things and you have to learn them. You are not born with culture, it is taught. We're going to look at two categories of culture, non-material and material, and let's start with non-material. Non-material culture are abstract things like beliefs and ideas. Now let's look at some categories that we can divide this into. So specific elements of culture are called cultural traits, and within non-material culture we have religion and folklore, values and holidays, things that we consider important and things that we celebrate, language, the words we speak and their meanings, and norms. Norms are proper ways of behaving, things that we consider to be correct or normal. Now let's look at the other type of culture, which is material culture. Material culture are objects, anything that can be touched. These are physical things. And let's look again at some different categories that we can divide this into. First one is architecture, buildings, structures, houses. Food, things that we eat, recipes, dishes. Art and music. Now, some of this might be included in non-material culture. Something like a song can't be touched, but you can touch the instruments and the written scores of things that are written down. All right, the last one is dress, fashion, things that we wear. All right, now let's review cultural diffusion, and your first term here is cultural hearth. The hearth is the origin of a cultural trait, the first place that a trait begins. Within cultural diffusion, which is the spread of cultural traits, we have two types, and the first type of cultural diffusion is expansion diffusion, and this is where the traits diffuse outwards from the hearth. Let's review some types of expansion diffusion. In this type, most people adjacent to the hearth adopt the trait. That means that the trait spreads to pretty much everyone, and that is called contagious diffusion. The next one is where people with power adopt the trait first, and then it spreads to other people, like the normal people without power. And that is called hierarchical diffusion. Hierarchical. And lastly, we have a form of diffusion where a trait is adopted somewhere else, but in a new form than it was originally. And that is called stimulus diffusion. All three of these are forms of expansion diffusion. Now let's look at the other kind of cultural diffusion, which is called relocation diffusion. In relocation diffusion, things do not expand outwards from the hearth. Instead, they are taken away from the hearth and brought to a new location via human migration. This is where people migrate, take their culture with them to a new place. So instead of spreading outwards little by little, it's taken away from the hearth and brought to a totally different place. All right, now let's review some terms related to the gravity model. Connectivity is a measure of interaction across space. Here's Waldo Tobler. The gravity model, also called Tobler's first law of geography, says that places that are close to each other are more connected or more similar than distant places. That means they have more communication, and the culture in those places will be more similar if they are closer to each other. Distance decay is the same as the gravity model, but it's said in a different way. And distance decay says that as distance increases, connectivity decreases. So in other words, the more distance there is between two places, the less they are connected and the less similar they will be. Now let's look at a contradiction to the gravity model. Space-time compression means that the time it takes for something to diffuse is getting smaller. It's taking less time for something to get from one place to another. And that makes it feel like places are getting closer even though they're actually not. They just feel closer because it's easier to communicate with people that live in those places. This contradicts the gravity model because the gravity model says that as places are farther apart, they'll be less connected. But space-time compression allows places that are far to actually be very connected. Some examples of technology that cause this are airplanes, container ships, and can you remember the probably most important example that is causing extreme space-time compression? And that is internet. The internet allows places that are really far away to communicate instantly. All right, now let's learn a new term. Here's Carl Sauer, another geographer. He came up with this idea called the cultural landscape. The cultural landscape is also called the built environment, and you should be familiar with both of these terms. They both mean the visible traces of a culture on the land or on the landscape. That means that you can look at the landscape and see culture. Let's look at an example. In this picture, we have three objects identified, which are part of the cultural landscape and which are not. Remember, the cultural landscape is visible traces of culture. So you have to ask yourself, which of these things is man-made? Number one is a mountain. That is not culture. So it is not part of the cultural landscape. Number two, this lake is also not culture, unless it's a man-made lake, but I don't think this one is. So number two is not a part of the cultural landscape either. Number three is. This is a man-made object. This might be considered art or architecture. And this reflects the culture of this place. So number three is part of the cultural landscape. To recap, the cultural landscape is anything visible on the landscape made by human beings. All right, the last word for today is taboo. A taboo is any behavior that's considered improper or unacceptable in a certain culture. These are things that cultures look down upon. They consider them wrong or weird or strange. You'll look at some examples of taboos in class. And now it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know any of them, just rewind the video and review. I will see you in class. Bye, students.